We start our class tonight and we think about desperate marriages and the effect that sin has on it. I want us to look at a little cartoon that really illustrates the problem that we're going to be facing. Here's a man. He's down on his hands and knees and he's proposing to this young woman. And her answer to him is, "Okay, I don't suppose a couple of years of married life could hurt me." But this young woman is wrong. A couple of years of married life could hurt her mentally, physically, and spiritually if she happens to make the mistake of marrying a jerk. And so what we want to do is we want to take a few minutes and we want to talk a little bit about what is involved in a jerk so that we can understand exactly what the problem is that we're going to be dealing with in this series of lessons. Basically, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing a study tonight of 1 Samuel 25, which is the story of Nabal and Abigail. And in this story, Abigail says that as Nabal is his name, so folly is with him. The word Nabal is a Hebrew word which means fool, and then folly is with him. And I want us to notice that if we were going to translate our Bible, the word fool, with a modern day word, the word jerk in our language today would probably be a much better translation than the word fool. When you look up the word jerk in Webster's dictionary, the word jerk means foolish. Then when you look up the word foolish, foolish implies the character of being or seeing or being unable to use judgment, discretion, or good sense. So a jerk simply means a fool. But the word fool in our language today is a much nicer and a much softer word than the word fool that is used in the Old Testament. When you look up the word fool in the Old Testament, what it means is stupid, silly, wicked, a vile person, and a perverse person. So the word fool has within it the idea of some kind of wickedness. It does not mean just a naive person, but a person who is obstinate and wicked and silly. He doesn't have the ability to think clearly because of the sin he's involved in. So I think if our Bible had translated the word fool that we see a lot in the book of Ecclesiastes, we see it a lot in the book of Proverbs, if it had translated it with a much harsher word like our word jerk, then I think many of these passages we would understand and appreciate them a lot more than what we do right now. As we go through this series of studies, we're going to be looking at a lot of passages in Proverbs that talk about the word fool, and we're going to be coming back and noticing this element of wickedness, vile person, and perverse person in these Proverbs that they're talking about. And I think these Proverbs are going to jump out and hit us, and we're going to realize that the book of Proverbs is just full of information dealing with what we're talking about, desperate marriages. Now, I do not have this definition fool in your notes. I do have the ones for jerk and foolish, but if you want the Old Testament's definition, then you need to copy that down. So the main point we're making is that marriage can be harmful. If a woman makes a mistake in marrying a man who is stupid, who doesn't have this basic understanding about how to get along in life because of his wickedness and because he is a vile person and a perverse person, then this is going to have an effect on her mentally, physically, and it's also going to have an effect upon her spiritually. Okay, as we continue our lesson, and if you need for me to come back later for you to copy that definition down later in our class, then I will come back and let you get it. But as we continue our study and think about the problem, I want us to talk about three classes of individual women. About 20 years ago, when I started teaching this material, my husband and I lived in Spokane. I started teaching ladies' classes. I had an opportunity at that time to teach three very different classes each week. And as I look back at my schedule and how I was writing class notes and doing all this teaching at one time, I think, how in the world did I have the energy to do that? But the key, when I think about it, is, well, I didn't have any kids. And when you don't have kids, your house doesn't get as messed up. And I had a husband who liked leftovers, so meals were easy. And it was easy to spend the time working on these classes. But I taught 3 classes a week to 3 very different groups of people. First of all, I started out the week teaching a class to the women in the congregation there in Spokane who were basically older women who had been married for a while. Now, to me, I was young, and these were older women to me. These were women who had been married 10 to 15 years, and so to me, these were older women. Then I would go to Moscow, and Moscow is a college town. The church there was comprised mainly of young brides, women who had only been married for a few months or at the most a few years, and I taught a class to them on the Bible's role for women. Then I didn't want all of my experience to just be based on what was involved with Christian women. I wanted some more experience just so I could be more rounded in my views. So at that time, the Fascinating Womanhood classes, there were lots of articles in the ladies' magazines and in the newspapers. And so I advertised or wrote to the Andelin Foundation and got permission to teach those classes, and then advertised in the newspaper for women to take those classes. And I had a lot of women from the community who were familiar with that material who came and took those classes. So I was teaching these 3 classes a week. And as I taught these 3 classes of very different women, I noticed some things very different about all of these different groups of women. For example, the older women who'd been married for 10 or more years, their attitude towards marriage was very different. Some of them were very, very bitter. They were very hesitant to accept new things. And I found myself continually having to prove to these older women from medical science and from psychological science, all of these things, that really God knew what He was doing. God's way was right, and God did know what He was doing when He gave these commands for women. So I continually found myself having to prove the logic behind these things. Now, with the young brides, they were an exciting group to teach because the love for their husbands still shone in their eyes. And all I had to do was say, God says, go do this. And they just ran home and they were just ready to love the socks off of their husbands. So their reaction was completely different. Then these women outside of Christ, I learned a lot from them. These women did not know each other, so they didn't feel like they had to put on airs or pretend around each other. They were not going to see each other outside of class. So they were very verbal. They were continually telling me what was going on in their class or in their marriages, and they would tell me when they would go home and try things, they would come back to class and say, I did such and such, and here's what happened. And so these were very vocal women that I was able to learn from. And there's several things that I learned from these groups of women. Basically, what I learned with these young brides is when they learned how to conduct their marriage according to God's wills early in marriage, then their marriage started off on a high plane, and it stayed there. The older women, as I said earlier, they had probably influenced my teaching more than any other group because they had made me realize the need to go back and to prove and to show the examples. But these women outside of Christ, what I saw in them is that their marriages were a lot worse than the marriages of the women in church. They had a lot more severe problems. They were dealing with problems with adultery and drunkenness, things of this nature, and yet their husbands were not interested in solving the problem with them. They were women who essentially were alone because their husbands were not Christians, as they were not, and they did not have this outside help. Now, since I taught this material 3 years ago, I passed out a survey for the women at the congregation there to fill out and to get back to me. And then I sent questionnaires to all the preachers' wives and all the gals back from the Spokane days that I still had their addresses. I sent them questionnaires and I gave them a copy of the tape, and I asked them to fill out the questionnaire and send it back to me. So I have gotten some questionnaires from some of these older women who originally took the classes. And what I have found in these last 3 years is that these older women had some of the same severe problems that these women outside the church had, but they were covering them up. They were hiding them, and because they were hiding them, then we were not able to deal with their problems. For example, one woman, in fact, there were several women in this group, and not only the women in Spokane, but also I came and taught this material at Seattle one time too. So I'm going from information from questionnaires from women in Seattle and also back in the Spokane days. There was one woman who came and talked to me about her husband, that her husband had no sexual desire, and she was very frustrated because he did not have one. And yet, in our studying about the sexual relationship, she neglected to tell me a very important thing that had a lot to do with solving that problem. And that is that her husband was an alcoholic. And he had no sexual desire because he was numbing his sensations and his responses with alcohol. So there was no way that we could solve that problem. But you know the tragedy of that woman covering up that problem at that time is that that man was a Christian, and everyone in that congregation loved that man, and that man, I think, had a genuine love for the people in that congregation. We were a young congregation of young people who were constantly struggling and studying together about church discipline. We had to discipline an older lady that just broke all of our hearts, but we were studying and we were learning these things together. And if this woman had been open and honest about her problem, then I genuinely believe that we probably could have helped her with that problem. We could have brought some moral pressure on that man to change, that I don't think he's had the opportunity to be in a similar situation since then to have that kind of pressure. So Christian women, what I'm seeing is they do have the severe problems. One of the young women, hadn't been married quite so long, that filled out a questionnaire. She suffered from physical abuse and verbal abuse, where her husband was running after her with a gun, saying, "You get back in the house, you're not going to be leaving me." Since then, my husband and I have counseled with a couple in California where the man was chasing his wife through the house with a knife. This is a man who's a Christian. So there are these severe problems in Christian marriages, but many times Christians are covering them up, and because they are covering them up, they're not being dealt with. So 3 years ago, I was saying women outside of Christ, their problems were more severe. Because of the questionnaires, I'm seeing the same problems within these other marriages, but there's still a difference. Women outside of Christ do not have the help and the benefit that the church can give them to solve that problems, whereas Christian women have some peer pressure that they can bring to bear on their husbands that these other women don't. A little later in one of our series, we're going to find that psychologists say that the most powerful tool that a woman has to make her husband change when there are severe problems like this is peer pressure. And because these women were covering up their problems and they did not have the ability to take advantage of this. Also, something I have learned in looking back at these marriages and these teaching opportunities is that Christians expect more from their marriages. When Christians have marriages, when they are simple, or have problems in their marriages, even when they are simple problems, because they are their problems, then they seem like they're the worst problems imaginable. And because their husband is a Christian, and because they are Christians trying to live a Christian life together, then they expect more. They seem to have a lower tolerance many times for problems. And so basically, here's just introducing the problem that there are these three classes of women. And something else I wanted to add to this. When I was teaching these women outside of Christ, some of these women that came to me, they kind of interviewed me before they came to a class because this was costing them money and they wanted to make sure they were going to get their money's worth. One woman, I met her in a sewing class and gave her an announcement, and she called me to talk to me. She says, "I'm in the process of figuring out how to divorce my husband. The only reason I want to come to your class is so that I can feel good about divorcing him. My conscience will be clear. I will know that I have done everything possible to have saved my marriage." In the course of about 8 weeks of applying, I don't want to necessarily say the fascinating womanhood principles, because at the end of each class I would present a Bible presentation of the same material. And I would say, I agree with her, Helen Andelin, because these things are in the Bible, or I disagree with her because this contradicts the Bible. And these women told me that the Bible presentation meant more to them than studying what some woman had said. So in the 8 weeks of basically learning the Bible principles, then this woman's husband completely changed, completely turned around. A man who was so bitter against his wife that she told me that he resented every mouthful of food she put in her mouth because he had to pay for it. At the end of 8 weeks, he gave her his bonus check of $350. He says, "Here, you go buy yourself some clothes because I've been spending a lot of money on myself." Another young girl came to class, or didn't come to class, she came to interview me. Her husband, I think I told you this story before, those of you that have the Song of Solomon class, that her husband was a long-haired hippie and she wore short mini skirts. She told me how she had read Fascinating Womanhood several months ahead of this time, and Helen Andelin said, "Turn all your finances over to your husband." So she had turned the checkbook and all the finances over to her husband, didn't question him, just trusted him to do what was right, and after 3 months she checked up on him. She found out that he had spent all their money and had not paid a single bill. So they were in terrible financial condition, and she was desperate for some teaching. That woman, I thought her situation was hopeless. I tried to talk her out of taking the classes. She says, "No, this is what I want to do." By the end of 8 weeks, her husband had got a promotion. He was starting to show more affection and love for her, and she got tremendous changes. So I've seen benefits, even marriages outside of Christ, that when they apply God's principles, then they do get the benefits from God's Word. And so this is, God's Word is something that is going to solve our problems. Now, basically, whenever you think about the three types of marriages, where I start is we start with the ABCs of marriage. The ABCs is where all marriages need to start. And the ABCs are just the foundation, the fundamentals, the easy part. Of course, as you look at these three things, none of these are really easy, but in comparison to other things, they are. We have to learn about subjection. And this is one of the reasons we've just finished the Song of Solomon series. We've been laying the foundation. We've been learning the ABCs of marriage so that we can go and build on that. Subjection is something that is very critical to a marriage. When there are desperate marriages where there is some type of sin involved on the husband's part, there is nearly always a misunderstanding of what is involved in subjection and leadership. And we're going to spend one whole night in this series talking about misunderstandings about subjection. We're also going to be looking at false Bible arguments that men use to keep their wives enslaved to sin. Most of these arguments are going to have to do with subjection. It's very interesting that one of the women at the women's shelter here in Tacoma, she told me that it's interesting that men who are not even Christians, husbands who don't even profess to be trying to obey Christ, she says that it's amazing how they like to go to the Bible and to use the Bible to manipulate and to keep their wife in subjection to their abuse of her. So this is something that is extremely critical for us to understand. If we're going to understand and solve problems, we have to understand what is involved in subjection and leadership, because it is involved in nearly every single problem. Healthy sexual attitudes are critical. In Proverbs 5, verses 18 through 19, this is where we saw that the older woman is to be an exciting lover. As we've been going through the Song of Solomon, we've been building healthy sexual attitudes. So this is something that is very critical. Something that happens a lot of times in desperate marriages is a lot of times that you'll find out that the woman was abused in her youth in some way. It's something that is very common. Whether that has something to do with the man she marries, I don't know. But it is something that is very common. Many times when a woman has been abused, she will bury that and try to overlook it and go on with her life, only to find out as she gets older, then it will crop up later in her marriage and it will cause problems. So if a woman has been abused, if she's been molested or raped, something of this nature, then she needs, I think, to get some counseling, and she needs to deal with that specific problem, because it is something that many times crops up and causes marriage problems. Then an ABC of marriage is reverence. And we spend a lot of time on talking about Ephesians 5:33, where God commands a woman to reverence her husband. And in 1 Peter 3, verses 1 through 2, even if her husband is an unbeliever, she is to reverence him. All marriage problems are magnified when there is no reverence in that marriage. Reverence doesn't solve the problems. It just simply creates an environment that makes it easier to solve the problems. Reverence is what we might call as this frosting on the cake. It's what puts the sparkle into a marriage. So these things are the ABCs of what every marriage must have before you go ahead and solve problems. Now, sometimes just by learning the ABCs, then marriages will become what they should become. In fact, I've had one gal in our classes this series who talked to me at the beginning of the classes and had what she would call a desperate marriage. And I would agree with her, with thought that it was a desperate marriage. Her marriage has completely turned around, and her husband has completely responded to the things that she has been learning just by her learning the ABCs. And I have seen this many times. Marriages that we would think would be desperate, they do respond and they do change. But what we're wanting to spend our focus on in our class in this series is the marriages that do not respond. So what we're going to be doing is we want to notice that there are 4 basic types of marriage. And you've seen this chart before, but I want us to go over it again because this is important to our study, this series that we're in. Basically, when couples learn their role in courtship, they start off marriage on a high plane, and they generally stay on a very high plane throughout their marriage. Now, that doesn't mean that they never have any problems. It simply means that they're not overwhelmed with problems. Because they have basic understanding, then they know how to go about solving their problems without harming their marriage. So we have marriages where they learn in courtship. This is why we went through the Song of Solomon, trying to help young girls learn ahead of time, be determined to talk about these things and help their fiancé learn someday. Then there are marriages which we would classify as good marriages. When they come along and learn God's will, then their marriage will rise to even higher level of being good and happy, and it will level off and generally stay there as they face the normal problems of life. Then there are marriages that we would call problem marriages. And in these problem marriages, when they learn God's will, then they many times they rise to a higher level, and then they level off. They're able to solve their problems. Some problems that could be involved in here is maybe you had adultery or something of this nature, where the man or the woman is not walking in adultery, it's just a slip. They're able to overcome that, and they're able to come up here onto a higher level. Then there are what I call desperate marriages, and this is what we're going to be focusing on in this series. When they learn God's will, their marriage gets a little bit better. It rises, but it does not rise to the same height as the other marriages. It rises to a certain degree, gets better to a certain degree, and then it levels off. And as it levels off, this leveling off can go on for it can either be a short period of time or a long period of time. This mainly is depending upon the emotional patience and strength of the woman, how long it levels off until some crisis happens. This crisis just may be the woman finally getting fed up. She doesn't want to take it anymore. It can be something that the man does that precipitates this crisis. But when this crisis happens, then the couple, one of two things happens. The couple either decides they're going to solve their problems, they're going to work on their marriage, and they solve the problems that should have been solved way down here. They finally deal with them, and the marriage comes up here, and it levels off and is what it should be up here as a good marriage. Yet I don't have these lines in the same height because these people have memories and problems of the past that many times keep their marriage from being what it should be or would have been if they just started out on a high plane and stayed there. Now, when this crisis happens, if the man, of course we're talking about in these desperate marriages, we're talking about from the standpoint of a woman married to a man who's involved in sin. Now, there are times when men are married to women who are involved in sin too. So just because I'm not going to be continually talking about women involved in sin doesn't mean these things don't apply to them just as well. So in this desperate marriage, when this crisis happens, either the man determines that he's going to do right and they get to work on their marriage and it gets better, or he doesn't care and the wife realizes that it's never going to be what it should be. Her attitude sinks. The marriage goes to a new low. And then when it goes down to this new low, it either levels off where she just says, I'm going to live with it, and she more or less lives her life, he more or less lives his life, and they go on and they just exist together. It'll either level off there, or the marriage will go ahead and completely disintegrate. It will completely dissolve into divorce or bitterness or whatever, but the marriage is not going to be the same after this crisis point. After this crisis is reached, it's either going to get better, or it's going to get worse and level off, or it's going to get worse and disintegrate. So this is the portrait of a desperate marriage, and this is what we're going to be focusing on tonight. Actually, the last 8 weeks we've been focusing up here on the courtship and the good and the problem marriages, and so this last 8 weeks is on the desperate marriages and how it is that we can help individuals in desperate marriages. Now, when we continue to think about the desperate marriages, I want us to focus a little bit on what is happening to the woman and what it is that makes a desperate marriage. We have up here our 4 basic marriages, and under desperate marriages, in a desperate marriage, to my knowledge, in every desperate marriage, there is always some type of sin in that marriage. Your problem marriages are maybe the ones where you've got bad judgments or personality conflicts, something of this nature. In a desperate marriage, it is different because there is always some type of sin involved. And I have down here the list of the different types of sins that I'm aware of that could be in a desperate marriage. I have up here as the first one, outbursts of temper. The word our Bible uses generally, like 1 Corinthians 5:11 and 6:10, is the word revilers. Our society nowadays calls this emotional abuse. So this is some type of sin. Or there can be a physical abuse where he is hitting and punching on her, this sort of thing. Failure to earn a living is something that is a sin, is something that causes these desperate marriage situations. Sexual defraud. This can be where the woman's legitimate sexual needs are not being solved, where she is being tempted to think illicit thoughts because her husband is not meeting legitimate sexual needs. And then adultery or homosexuality also causes desperate marriages. Judging motives. This is something that is also a sin. Judging motives is involved in nearly every one of these other aspects of sin. But it is something that a man can do without being involved in these other things that is going to cause his marriage to be a desperate situation. Drunkenness is something that we know is a sin. Hindering his wife from serving God. This is something that is a sin. God has told us to assemble with one another. And then bitterness. Many times you'll find men who are not involved in any of these other things. They don't have outbursts of temper. There's no physical abuse. They earn plenty of money. They satisfy their wives' sexual needs. There's no adultery. There's probably some judging of motives, but there's no drunkenness. They attend worship services all the time. But yet, because of that man's bitterness, because of his bitter attitude towards the wife, which she feels and knows is there, that marriage is in a desperate situation. The word bitterness is a sin in Colossians 3:19, where God has told men to love their wives and not be embittered against them. Embittered means to embitter, exasperate, to render angry, indignant, or irritated. Now, next week when we come back, we're going to look at the profile of a sinner. Some of these sins, these outbursts of temper, physical abuse, some adultery, drunkenness, these are sins that grow over a period of time. You don't just have a certain level of that sin and it levels off. These are what I would call growing sins. And so we're going to look next week at the profile of a sinner, and we're going to see how it is that sin grows and gets worse over a period of time. And then we're going to come back and look at the verses that go with each one of these sins, and we're going to talk about how they either fit the picture or disagree with the profile of a sinner. So this is something I'm going to spend more time on next week. Okay, so now as we're seeing a little bit better what's involved in the desperate marriage, I want us to look at the desperate wife and to see what it is that is happening to her. Okay, the desperate wife, she gets married. When she gets married, she doesn't expect to have a desperate marriage or a miserable relationship. She marries expecting happiness, to have a wonderful marriage. This is her goal. This is what she wants. Then as their marriage goes on, marriage problems begin to arise. Of course, marriage problems, as we've talked about with Song of Solomon, they're common. This is normal. But she's having some problems arise in her marriage that are not normal, that are not common because of the husband's involvement with sin. And as we talked in the Song of Solomon class, women have a single-mindedness that men don't. As you remember, we talked about how that when the fetus is in the womb, if it is a male, it's being bathed, its brain is being bathed with the male hormones, and the female baby, her brain is being bathed with the female hormones, and it is affecting the way they think, that men and women simply think differently from each other. Men, as we talked about in our class, they can think on two different things and pay attention to two complex things at the same time, whereas a woman can't. A woman is more single-minded. When a woman has problems in her marriage, she can't go to work and forget them. She can't even do the dishes and forget them. She can't love on her children and forget them. These problems nag on her, and they are constantly there with her, pushing her towards finding a solution. And this is the way that God made us, and this is something that is generally good, but it's something that's going to cause a lot of problems for the desperate wife. Because women have a determination to solve their problems that men many times do not have. And so if marriage problems arise, she can't go to work and forget them like her husband does, and she has the single-mindedness. Then, as the problems continue, what she does next is she blames herself. And this is another feminine characteristic, that when women have problems in their marriages, their first solution is to blame themselves and to try to find the solution within themselves, to change themselves to solve the problem. Again, I think this is the way that God made us. This is something that in the beginning is good, because we have tremendous influence over our husbands and over our children. And if we can look within ourselves, and if we can see where we need to be more submissive, where we need to fix better meals on time, where we need to express our love more openly, if we can look within ourselves and do these things, then we're going to solve our problems. We're going to create a better emotional climate for our husband to work and to solve his problems. And in the beginning, these are good. Now, basically, the difference between the men and the women is in Ephesians 5:28. This is where God talks about, or Paul talks about, husbands are to love their wives as they love themselves. Men generally do not blame themselves for their marriage problems like women do. Men know how to love themselves better than women do. Now, in Ephesians 5:28, Paul doesn't criticize the man for loving himself. He just says, you make sure you love your wife the way you love yourself. This is what is important, to love the wife in the same way. So here it is, she starts to blame herself for her marriage problems. So she may be taking marriage classes, and as she takes those, what she sees is she sees other women's husbands respond. Other women who have these good marriages and these problem marriages, she sees their marriages shoot up here to a new level of happiness. And she sees that, and this is something that causes her grief because her marriage is not shooting up here to this happiness either. In George Gilder's book, Men in Marriage, I've talked to you quite a bit about that in the Song of Solomon series, about how he talks about how it is that men just absolutely need a wife. And in his book, he calls a man without a wife a barbarian. He says a man that doesn't have a wife, he's more likely to commit suicide, has a higher crime rate, that he doesn't earn as much. And so a man without a wife to him is a barbarian. But do you know what George Gilder calls women? He calls women princesses. The woman is the princess that comes along and tames the barbarian, who gives his life meaning, who makes him want to go out and conquer the world for her, and that men need their wives, and that men are going to respond, generally speaking, to a wife who is the things that God would have her to do. So here it is, she sees other husbands responding, but instead of her marriage responding, her marriage problems continue. The effect that this has on her is that she blames herself even more. If only I were prettier. If only I could get pregnant. If only I hadn't gotten pregnant so many times. If only I could control my emotions. If only I could please him. If only I knew what he wanted. So there's all these if-onlys, these illogical if-onlys, where she is blaming herself for things that really are not her fault. When she begins to do this, then depression sets in. Up here, she was looking to herself and trying solutions. Down here, she is blaming herself illogically, thinking that something must be wrong with her instead of seeing the problem as it really is. Now, in Acts 3:19, it's where it talks about when we're repenting of sins or things that we need to change in our life, then we have seasons of refreshing. When we look at our life and blame ourselves for things that we're really doing wrong, we feel good about it. But because these women know that the problem is not that they can't get pregnant, or it's not that they had too many kids, or it's not because they're not pretty enough, because they deep in their hearts know that those things aren't true, then depression sets in, and they're having to struggle with depression. Then, as this cycle continues, we find that the next thing that happens is her self-image deteriorates. And she has a lower and lower self-image of herself than ever. In Matthew 22, verse 39, this is where Jesus tells us to love others as we love ourselves. And if we're going to love others, then we're going to have a proper love of ourselves. And we're going to be spending some time on self-image and seeing how to take care of ourselves, how to love ourselves, so that we can love other people, so that we can act in the best interest of other people. But because she is not having the proper attitude towards herself, by blaming herself, then her self-image deteriorates even more. What happens is then she begins to fight for emotional survival. She is trying to just survive as a person. Sunday afternoon, I went to the women's shelter at Tacoma. They were having a counseling session, and I sat there and listened to women who are in desperate marriages talk for 2 hours. And one of the most common remarks I was hearing these women say is, I'm losing it. I'm losing myself. And the leader who was telling these women, she says, I know exactly where you're coming from, because when I was in an abusive relationship, I was losing it. And so they start to fight for emotional survival. One common remark you hear these women say is, I feel like I'm drowning. They are losing themselves as a person, and they are fighting to just survive as an emotional person. And this is a very critical time in these women's lives. And when they begin to fight for emotional survival, their attitude changes, and they begin to blame their husband. Whereas they had originally blamed themselves, now they are starting to blame their husband for everything. And because they haven't been dealing with the real problem and been blaming themselves, and a lot of times the blame that they heap up on their husbands is irrational blame. Their husband can do no right. They begin to get very bitter. Many times when you talk to these women, they're very bitter towards men in general, not only just their husbands. So then she begins to blame her husband. The natural consequence of that is that she confronts her husband. Her husband in Proverbs 29, verse 9, here's another one of those fool passages. When a wise man has a controversy with a fool, then his reaction is to either react in either anger or ridicule. When she confronts her husband, he's involved in sin, and we're going to also see this in our profile of a sinner that we're going to look at next week. then his reaction is to get very angry. Of course, anger is a very strong intimidator that makes many women back off. It makes them bury the problem, at least as far as their husband is concerned, because they can't face him, or ridicule of her needs, ridicule of her thoughts, ridicule of her as a person. These are very powerful tools that these men use in this situation. Okay, once she has confronted her husband, there is no solution because of his anger and his ridicule. He's not dealing with the problem. He's not willing to work on it. Then her depression deepens. And it gets worse than ever. Some of these women, one woman that I have a friend who's working with a woman in one of these desperate situations, she says that every time she talks to her friend on the phone, and they don't live in the same area, and she says that because that the woman feels free to talk to her is because she doesn't have to see her and face her day by day. So they talk on the phone. And she says this woman is talking about suicide, that her depression is so deep that she mentions suicide. And she said the last time that she talked to her, she says, and when she talks about suicide, she says, well, what about the children? Trying to help conjure up some attitudes of preserving her life and dealing with this problem. The last time she talked to her, the woman said, I'm still thinking about suicide, and if I do it, I'm going to take the children with me. And this is a woman who is a Christian, and I'm just telling you this to illustrate how bad this problem is and what these women are struggling with. Okay, one way they deal with this depression many times is they begin to blame God for their problems. After all, they've been working on their marriage, they've been trying to do everything wrong. It looks to them like God is just singling them out and choosing to make their life be miserable. And another reason why they blame God, I think, is because it is a lot safer from their point of view to blame God than it is to blame their husband. After all, God is up in heaven and their husband is here on earth, and if they blame their husband, then they have got to deal with his anger and his ridicule. And also, as we're going to look next week at the sin that he's involved in, they're going to also have to face his sin and to deal with it. Blaming God is the easy way out, because then they do not have to face these problems here on earth. These women, they begin to blame God. They start to fall away from the church. Sometimes they fall away from the church in a gradual way. Other times it's just a very cut and dried, this is the end of it, and there's no drawn out process of falling away from God and from Christ in this way. Then she leaves, when they get down to this point, many times you see these women, they leave their husband and they leave the church, or they turn their back on Christ. And when they leave their husband, many times they turn their back on their Christian friends, because they don't want their Christian friends coming and making them feel guilty and making them feel like they have to go back into this relationship with their husband that they know they can't deal with, that they know they were fighting for emotional survival. Everything underneath here is a fight for emotional survival. The blaming God, the leaving their husband, leaving the church, is just trying to survive emotionally. Now, when I taught this 3 years ago, and have been talking to several women who were down here in this process of thinking about leaving their husband and leaving the church, and listening to their attitudes toward God, I thought these women sound just like Job. You remember the story of Job, how that Job had boils. He's covered from head to toe with his boils. And then while Job was suffering, word was spreading all over about how Job was suffering. And Job had 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And these 3 friends come to see Job and to supposedly comfort him in his affliction. And when Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar got there and saw how horrible Job's boils were, they sat down with him and they didn't open their mouths for 7 days. So apparently they were so shocked and overcome by the sight of him that for 7 days they couldn't say anything. So you think, what? These guys are really going to know how to comfort Job and how to make Job feel better. But do you know what these 3 men did when they finally opened their mouths? They said, Job, what did you do for God to punish you like that? Boy, you must have done something really wicked for God to do this to you. And they didn't have a bit of sympathy at all for Job. And there's a lot of the verses in the book of Job are just devoted to Job answering these guys, where he's saying, I didn't do anything. I know that God's not punishing me. But these 3 guys kept it up so much that Job finally caved in, and Job finally did sin with his mouth, and Job finally did blame God for all of his misery. And so when that happened, then a 4th man, Elihu, came in, and Elihu was a young man. He chewed these other guys out. He says, you're older, you ought to know better, and I feel bad about being a young man having to correct you. But he says, Job didn't do anything wrong. And then he jumped onto Job for sinning with his mouth. And he says, Job, says, do you even know how lightning comes about? Do you even begin to understand how the universe works? You don't have any business criticizing God when you don't understand these things that are simple to God. And God has something in mind here that you don't know anything about. So what happens a lot of times when we have a friend or somebody we know that is in this desperate situation, someone who is fighting for emotional survival, instead of comforting them and trying to show them how God is really on their side, God does have solutions, God does want to solve their problem, then we sound like Eliphaz, Bildad, and so far. We say, oh, if you'd just be more submissive, if you'd just be show more reverence, if you'd just more this or more that, if you'd just do what your husband wanted, then you wouldn't have this problem. And this is not what these women need, because many times these women, they are trying to please their husbands. They are fighting for emotional survival. They're trying to do what is right. The problem is not an attitude of not trying to do what is right. The problem is the sin that their husband is involved in, and they're not knowing how to face that sin and to deal with that sin. So we need to be like Elihu. We need to turn their minds and their hearts back to God, and we need to show them that God does have some solutions. And so that's what we're going to be working on in this class, is looking at God's solutions and learning how it is that we can help them. And we need to realize that these women may be trying harder to please God and to please their husbands than their sisters in Christ who have the good marriages and the marriages where they learn how to do things right in courtship. Because, if you have a good marriage, you can make a mistake. You can say something flippant to your husband, or you can say something that really is not submissive, and he won't even seem to notice, because you've got a good marriage. You've got a good relationship. But these women in these desperate marriages, all they have to do is to say the most innocent thing, and their husband is off in a tirade, and he's overreacting, and he is abusing them. So many times these women are trying harder. They've got more devotion, trying harder to save their marriage and to make a go of it than their sisters are, who are married to men who are not involved in sin. So we need to look at these women, and we need to realize that they are facing a very serious problem. And as we think about the problem that these women are facing, I have up here a picture of women of all different ages to just represent women in the church. And I want us to think about the effect that desperate marriages have upon our church. And in a congregation where you've got women facing desperate marriages, many times these women are very attractive women. They are women with very pleasing personalities. They are women who are hard workers, women who want to serve God. They are women who are active in the Bible class programs. They are assets. They are very good benefits to the church. But here we lose one because of her desperate marriage, because she's unable to face the problems alone. We lose another one. Of course, this is something, as I talk to people around the country, that this is something that is happening, where people are just turning their backs on God's Word, turning their backs on Christianity. And people cannot understand why it is that they're doing this. And what's happening is that we're finding that the church is really being harmed, that it is losing many of its best workers simply because these people do not know how to deal with sin that is in their homes. So this is something that is a very grave problem. It's something that we need to see if we can learn how to help these women, so that not only can their lives be more beneficial and more happy, but so that we can have their care in the church.